Hi, this is Russ Conti again. Okay, I think we're gonna go ahead and get started. It's about 3 minutes after 2 or 3 minutes after two. Um, Obviously, this is a topic which has captured a lot of interest. It's one of the certainly more registered and attended webinars I've done in a while, maybe of all. So it's great, and I see a lot of familiar names, both from a lot of these webinar series and just folks I know from around the industry. So it's always great. I feel like it makes it a little bit more intimate meeting when we've got a lot of folks on that we know. There is a chat box down on the. You should have a GoToMeeting chat screen that you should be able to enter any questions in, and I've got Terry Finan on from our team as well, and so hopefully at the end of the session we'll have a little bit of time for Q&A. And I think this is an area that there's lots of opportunity for, I guess I should say, in the industry for doing things a little bit better. So, the name of the topic is basically what we're talking about, budgeting. I mean, a lot of clubs right now are in the budgeting season. They're in the budgeting cycle. I don't think too many folks in the industry, whether you're on the board or the GM or the controller, looks forward to budgeting season. But it's certainly a necessary evil for clubs, as it is really for any business entity, and certainly our business entities. A little unique, but they certainly are businesses. So, what we're going to do today is we're going to talk a little bit about, generically about budgeting methodologies. That's a little generic, although we're going to put a twist on the end of that a little bit and put our club benchmarking twist onto it. I think as most all of you know kind of what we do in the industry and how we interact with the industry. We do an awful lot of education based on all the data gathering we do. Obviously, we have lots and lots of clubs that are subscribers to the service, but we never have a problem in just trying to convey back to the industry at large, whether those folks are subscribers or not, things that we've learned by analyzing the data over these last 5 years. And I always wonder, are we going to hit a point where there's nothing else to learn? And we haven't hit that yet. And I honestly don't think we're going to hit that. I think there's a lot for this industry to garner from dissecting and understanding really all the wisdom that exists within the 4,000 or 5,000 clubs that make up this industry. So we're going to look at those methodologies. We're going to talk a little bit about strategic budgeting, kind of the mindset behind it. We're going to look at the measures, and a lot of those measures, frankly, are measures that we've talked about, but we're going to talk about it from a different perspective. We're not going to do, a lot of the webinars we do, there is a bit of a deep dive into the numbers. We're not going to do that because a lot of these numbers, you can really get the deep dive by looking at some of the other webinars we've done, especially in the Executive Dashboard series. So we're certainly going to reference them and talk about why they're important from a budgeting perspective, but not necessarily dissect them as deep as we have in other webinars. There is a little bit of a confession. Most of the webinar, all really of the other Fast Fact webinars we've done, I'd say they're equally as valid and viable whether you're a club benchmarking subscriber or not. This one has a little bit more, slightly, I would say maybe it's not 50-50, it's 60-40. It's slightly more geared towards those that are club benchmarking members, only because, not conceptually, but only because it's a lot easier for them to actually implement the concepts that I'm talking about, because frankly, the tool we've got and that they have access to makes it pretty automated to roll out the kind of mindset that we're talking about. So that's just wanted to make that up front, because I am going to show a little bit more relative to the platform than I do typically, and I wanted to say that up front because, as I think most folks know, we're not here to try to sell the platform. We're here to educate, but I did want to mention that up front. I always talk about this. I'm not going to go through it. I usually preface a lot of what I talk about with some information around the industry and the governance model of the industry. But I've certainly done that many, many times on these webinars, and I don't want to take the time today to do that because we've got a lot else to talk about. But specifically, when you get into the budgeting, it is a bit of a contact sport. It certainly depends on the club. Some clubs have a more efficient process. Some clubs have a more insular process where there are fewer people involved. Some have lots of people involved, and that obviously dictates sort of the complexity of the process. But the bottom line is, how do we make it quicker, better, and maybe most importantly, more meaningful? The other two things are great to be done quicker, but but ultimately, do you end up with something that might have a little bit more meaning that could be measured, and that is tied to the strategy and financial sustainability of the club? If we look at the typical budget scenario, budget process, I mean, it's not unusual for it to take a couple months in a club, which is a long time. I mean, if you're thinking about a typically $6, $7, $8 million club, if you're spending 2 months on going through the budget process, that's a long time. If you're Google, Apple, GM, a large company with lots and lots and lots of moving parts and many employees, thousands and thousands, it wouldn't be surprising for that budget process to take a couple months. In the club world, honestly, I think with a little bit of what we're talking about today, and I think with a little bit of effort, frankly, I think it can be a few week process, maybe a month. We've had taking the methodologies we're talking about here. We've had clubs tell us we've gone from a 6-week process to a 2-week process, and that's great because there's no reason for it to be that long. It clearly is often politically charged. It kind of is the opportunity for people to have a real an impact on their tribe, if you will. If they view their role in the club or on the board or in the finance committee as representing their tribe, then the budget process is the way to sort of implement that constituency or support that constituency. So that's, politics is rife in the process. Obviously the finance committee itself, we think should end up seeing lots of detail, not surprisingly. The board, where we're talking a little bit more about here, should stay at the strategic level and shouldn't be down into the individual line items, but should really be concerned. We're going to look at some questions, but ultimately with the question of, is the club on a sustainable path that can support itself financially and is supporting the member expectations of the club, right? That of the members. That's really, to me, the board level is that sustainability and relevance question and service level question. The questions certainly roll around when you hear about the budget process. Should we have a dues increase? Hey, we should make money in food and beverage next year. Are we spending too much or too little on the course? I think we had too much labor last year. I didn't think we have enough labor last year. All the stuff, frankly, we talk about, in club benchmarking a lot, and is very generally in a opinion-based environment. So we're going to talk about that. And we think if you look at strategic budgeting, what are maybe the questions, and some of this is a little bit of a setup, and some of this won't be surprising to you because the things that we've really been pushing in the industry because of their importance. But questions like, are we generating enough gross profit to cover the fixed expenses of the club? Is our gross profit allocated proportionally in a way that reflects our culture and strategy? Are we producing capital at a level that adequately, allows adequate reinvestment in the club? Do we have the right balance between service and financials and efficiency? Those are, to me, pretty strategic questions upon entering the budget process. And when you get into things like gross profit, when you look at the big companies and the folks that really understand financial management, not accounting, but financial management in companies, they get that there are a few indicators that are completely predictive to the end result of the company, and it's no different here. But those are more strategic level questions as opposed to, should we make money in food and beverage? Did we spend too much on the course? Should we have a dues increase? Things like that. Because if you answer the questions that I'm showing here, then frankly those other questions they sort of go away because the direction you should take around dues or around food and beverage kind of become more automatic. If we look at the different types of budgeting, there are 3 different types that I'm going to talk about today, and I'm really going to talk about one, but I'm prefacing with a couple others. There's a budget process called zero-based budgeting, and very simply, zero-based budgeting just starts with a blank sheet of paper. So every year, essentially every department, might be down to every employee, but certainly every department, essentially has to justify their spending levels and their existence for the coming year. So let's say we spent, $1.2 million on the course next year, so we're going to spend $1.2 million or $1.3 million next year. You're just going to start from a blank sheet of paper. And the reality is, not a lot of clubs do this. I don't know that no clubs do this. I certainly haven't run into any clubs that do this, and I think it by and large is, non-existent in the club industry. Pretty safe to say. Then we look at baseline budgeting, and I think this is where the vast majority of clubs live from their budgeting process. And baseline budgeting simply, and I get most of you probably know this, but it's a good starting point. It's a process that uses last year's budget, frankly, as a benchmark for future spending. We're going to talk about the pros and cons of each one of these in a minute, but that's what baseline budgeting means. It uses basically only your own internal experience as the benchmark. Okay, that's the key point of it. Now, what we're calling strategic budgeting, it basically applies the intelligence of industry norms and benchmarks that we know ultimately correlate to financial health. So it's not just using your own experiential or budget-based benchmarks, but it's actually using the wisdom of the industry to say, okay, this is where we've always spent to this proportion or to this ratio or to this amount. How does that compare to the way other clubs do it, right? So strategic benchmarking is bringing it up a level, not just looking in your own house, but looking externally. Obviously, there's pros and cons to each one. Zero-based to go very, very quickly. It's a slow process. It would in effect, force a deep discussion of levels and priorities every year because you literally have to re-justify your spending every year. I can imagine in a club it would be almost impossible to really pull this off given the tribes and politics that exist. And it's very, very solo oriented, right? So you're really looking at department by department, and the downside of it is 80% of your time is spent on that department level, and very little of it is spent looking at the overall club. So, and where that overall club is where you end up with that overall financial sustainability perspective. And it would use club language and myths as part of its basis. In baseline budgeting, it's faster than zero based, no question about that. But it certainly makes the assumption that the allocation and priorities that we had set were basically correct. So if you did have, frankly, a bad budget or a misallocation, if you will, or the budget didn't really reflect what you think the strategy of the club is, you're just going to perpetuate that. And so, the budget ultimately is a statement of the club's priorities. And if it's not reflecting where you think the membership wants the club to be, then that can be a mismatch that just gets perpetuated year over year. It tends to be a little more solo oriented because you're looking at department by department. And again, it uses that club language and myth. So it's you sort of discount what the outside world does because you're sort of living in that world of where we think we're different. Well, we're really a seasonal club. We're a desert club. We're in an area that has lots of we're more in an urban setting. Whatever the language or myth might be, and you don't tend to think by language. I mean, you don't tend to think in terms of like gross profit, gross margin. You're not thinking that way. You're thinking more in the club language or which might be common across the industry, or it might be a language that you've invented sort of inside your own club. But it tends not to be business language is the main point. If you get to strategic budgeting, from our perspective, we really think it's the fastest process of the three. Not only is it faster, but there's a greater level of confidence because it's not just it's looking at your where you are, where you're setting your budget. And how does that compare to what the industry tends to do? And so, it's a little bit of herd mentality. And obviously, you don't want to go over the bridge with the rest of the herd. But generally, if you understand how the middle point of the industry or 75th percentile of the industry is performing, and then you tend to mimic the way that part acts, you're obviously going to tend to mimic their results. So there is more confidence associated with that, as opposed to the big ego in the room that might exist in some clubs that just says, we need to do it this way, we need to do it that way, we have to spend more, we have to spend less, right? They don't have any of that. And it puts it all in perspective to the overall club, and we'll talk about that in a minute. One of the key parts, I think, is it does reinforce the financial drivers of the club. It doesn't hide the financial drivers, but it reinforces them. Where does the money really come from that supports this club? And how do we get more of that? And how do we, separate the difference between revenue that we like because it's a marker for activity in the club, and revenue that we like because it funds the fixed expenses of the club, right? There's two different kinds of revenue, and you better understand if you're trying to drive food and beverage, I hope it's because you want to drive activity and vim and vigor in the club, as opposed to trying to fund the operations of the club that way. So, we'll just blow through this, but it does tend to mute the politics because we're using the wisdom of the industry, if you will, and it has a very business-like language and set of realities, right? Hey, we're not different from other clubs. We're like other clubs. So when you're in that strategic budgeting, the mindset that has to be a baseline for it, ideally, is that starting points, right? Your club is not unlike any other club. You might love your club. Your club might have its own personalities. But from a financial model, we've been through it, many, many times, and you get it. It's not unlike other clubs, right? That's a key point to get. They have a common financial model, and the budget is, in fact, the implementation of your strategy and culture. So that's why it's critical to where you go with the club. But predictive management is achievable, meaning that the budget isn't just about setting what you're going to spend. That's certainly what it is tactically, but it ultimately is about is this club on a sustainable path? And if it's not, what are the things we would tweak with this strategic budgeting mindset to get us on that path? So, we already know what benchmarks to use when measuring clubs strategically. We've been talking about that. I'm actually on an airplane after this webinar heading out to Monterey Peninsula Country Club. I'm looking forward to it. I haven't been there before, but to deliver an HFTP education session on executive dashboard KPIs. And, I've been doing a lot of those over the last few weeks, and so has my partner, you guys know Ray. But so we already know what the measures are, right? We've pretty much, I think, shown folks not everybody's there yet, but we know what the right measures are. So the real question is, why not use those same measures in the budget process? There's no reason, when we look at all the KPIs we do, there's no reason to only look at them reflectively, right? We tend to look at them, only like how did the club do? What did we do? How did we perform? But why not use those same measures in a predictive manner, right? So while you're setting departmental budgets, why not roll all that up and look at that in the same exact viewpoint? So, I'm not going to go through all these, obviously, but you've seen all this. This is the one of the executive dashboard reports that comes out of the platform. And we'll talk a little bit about them, but gross margin and dues ratios and net operating result. When you think about it, if you could apply these ratios and this viewpoint, not just to what happened last year, but actually apply it to what does our budget or frankly forecast look like for the coming year, then that's a pretty powerful view, because it tells you where are we going to end up, and you don't have to get there to find out, right? And if it looks like some of these core KPIs aren't going to be in the right place, don't we want to know about that in the budget process as opposed to finding out at the end of the year? So the ability to tweak the budget process so that you end up with the KPI levels you want and need is a huge victory for clubs, we think. And so it's something that happens when you set the budget, but then obviously as you have your forecast throughout the year, the opportunity is to see that result ongoing. So when you get to the end of the year, you don't have any surprises. So this is the part I am going to admittedly dip into a little bit around the platform, just for the next couple slides though. So for some of the members that have joined recently, you'll see now in the platform you log in, there's an area called financial forecasting. And it's a very simple area. I'm just going to show you a couple screenshots in a minute. When some of you log in, a lot of you actually, you won't see that. The reason, and I'm not going to get into it now, you'll see a little pop-up, but there is a different level of platform you have to get onto. It's not a big deal. It ends up being a few $100 difference in membership, but there is a different level because we've capped the old platform and we're moving forward with the new platform, new plan. But so you'll see that financial forecasting section, and when you go into it, it basically has a very simplistic area of where to enter data. Now, all we're trying to do, if you're familiar with the finance and operations section, there's many, many, many data points, right? There's a lot, and while we load the financials from the trial balance, there's a lot of others. In the forecasting section, it's much simpler because all we need are the 20 or so data points that allow us to generate the executive dashboard KPIs in an automated fashion for your budget, not for the past year. So the real win here within the platform for folks, again, I'll get back to the generic stuff in a minute, but it's very simple, right? About 20 data points go in, and in fact, we actually load your prior prior ending data. So you might even just adjust it. Hey, dues revenue is going to be up 100 grand. F&B revenue is going to be up 100 and down 100 in cost, whatever it might be. You can just do those puts and takes, instantly see your KPIs for the forward view. And so this predictive management means greater understanding and fewer surprises, as I talked about. So when that data is loaded, which takes literally minutes, now you've got this instant KPI dashboard KPIs at a glance. You can see where you are precisely, and more importantly, you get to then run a couple of reports that let you look at it graphically and tabular and all those things against whatever peer set you select. So that is a pretty powerful new area of the platform, and this is a real mission that we've been on. And the first few years of the mission was, boy, we need a lot of data so that we can really analyze the industry and try to understand things in different perspectives that people didn't have before. And then the last couple of years has been about, all right, now we're conveying back to the industry, what are the measures that seem to really matter? Things like the available cash model, things like the executive dashboard report, again, in a reflective view, but understanding the club better than you did. And now we're moving to the mission of, that's great, but the real goal is, how do you change future behavior? And that's what I mean when I say predictive management. And so now we're moving into, let's use all this knowledge and wisdom that together we've all gathered and put in this platform, and let's use it looking forward so that you can get ahead of the curve, both from an educating the board perspective and from a club performance perspective. I think that's a pretty interesting shift, and I think it's a pretty powerful shift. And we're obviously happy to answer any questions around this new section. We're happy to help people get rolling with it. But we think it's an interesting shift of where we're headed. I'm just keeping on the clock here. So I'm not going to go through the numbers of everything here. I'm going to go through a little bit of the strategic intent behind the thought process of strategic budgeting. But again, to start encapsulating it a little bit, it's not just using your own data to set the forward-looking budget, but it's using the data, the wisdom of the industry, if you will, the data of the industry. Now, not as a dollar amount, right? Knowing what another club charges for dues on a per member basis is not something that's highly actionable. The dues ratio, knowing that at most clubs, dues represents about 50% of the operating revenue. I know some clubs it's higher, some clubs it's lower, but things like that, knowing, hey, wow, we just set a budget that puts our dues ratio at 45% and our gross margin at 50%. That's 5 and 10 points lower than the industry runs. That's probably not a good launch pad for our next year budget, right? Because you're going to get to the end of the year, have an operating deficit, and wonder what the heck happened. So that's why getting ahead of the curve on these ratios, not just reflectively, is really important. So obviously gross margin is one, and where the gross margin comes from, and where the gross margin goes. This is all available cash model stuff, and you can look at the other webinars to deep dive in those. But it's critical, because when you're getting into discussions in the budget, like the allocation of your gross profit, because knowing how much gross profit you generate is key, and how you allocate that, because that gets you out of those crazy discussions around, someone else is spending 1.6 million on their course. We're only spending 1.4, so clearly we're not spending enough. Well, if your allocation is such that you can only afford to spend 1.2 million, then you're at the right amount. You're about a third of your gross profit, and you're at the right amount. So it's really critical to look at not the number side of it, but the ratio side of it. And that's, again, how clubs start to use this in a strategic benchmarking or budgeting concept. And I know I'm going through this very quickly, but I think a lot of you are familiar with the background data of what I'm talking about. It's just a function of applying it to the budget process, not just to the year end, hey, how did we do last year process. There is a variation to this. Some clubs, it's not terrible. I mean, some clubs use what they call a dues allocation model, which in effect is taking the net of each department and saying, basically how much of our dues did that suck away. It's okay. It's probably better than nothing, but I don't really love that model. I like that available cash model that we've been using more, because I think it's important to drive the business mentality gross profit, where did the gross profit come from and where did it go, as opposed to thinking it's only just a dues model. I mean, clearly most of dues comes from gross profit, but I think looking at it in that more holistic and standard business terms, I think ends up serving the club well, as opposed to just a dues allocation model. But it's pretty close. I mean, if you look at the allocation, a dues allocation model perspective versus the available cash perspective, the ratios are actually pretty close. So it's not terrible. Why would you look at dues ratio in a predictive manner, right? Why would you generate that ratio out of your budget? Why? Well, we know that in general about 80% of gross profit comes from dues. So if you have a weak dues ratio, chances are you're going to have a weak gross profit and gross margin. We know there really is no substitute for dues revenue, so it drives the behavior of all revenues not created equal. $1 of dues revenue performs a different function than $1 of F&B revenue. And we know that the median's around 50%. Some clubs are higher because they have a more dues-centric mentality and they treat everything in the club as an amenity. And so they're really dues-driven as opposed to a la carte driven, as other clubs tend to be. Net operating bottom line ultimately answers the budgetary question of, did we produce enough money to fund operations? And clubs, obviously, in their budget process, they generate that. They might generate a little bit differently than we do, but they do generate that perspective. Capital is obviously huge, and I think sometimes capital, in the operating budget process, capital doesn't always get the attention that it deserves. But we look at what we call net available capital. It's completely predictive. It's one of the most predictive things there are. If in the coming year you don't generate enough what we call net available capital, which is basically the pile of money you generated after operations and capital income, then it's pretty safe to say if those are anemic, the ability for you to reinvest back in the club is also anemic. So it doesn't by itself indicate whether you have enough or not. It just indicates how much should we generate and how does that compare, right? We know in the industry the median's about a capital ratio of about 11%. So there is a little bit of wisdom you can use. Now, there is a new mentality we're starting to use, and this gets actually almost a little bit towards a funding depreciation mentality, quite honestly. But as a test, if you use your depreciation expense as just a guidepost, what was our depreciation expense and what was our net available capital? Because let's face it, I mean, depreciation is in fact a number that represents how much of our asset base actually decayed, right? Think of it that way. It decayed and ultimately is moving through its replacement life cycle. And based on the studies we've done, we think that the net available capital should be at least about 1.3 times depreciation as an approximation, because that takes into account the time value of money, and it also takes into account that in fact some clubs end up having some fully depreciated assets, and obviously that's not being counted. And we've looked at it a couple different ways, percentage of overall fixed assets and things like that. But it's a pretty good guidepost, right? If your net available capital is X, or your depreciation, I should say, is X, your net available capital as a guidepost is about 1.3x. It means you're probably, from a maintenance capital perspective, probably in about the right place. Now, that doesn't really cover your aspirational capital, right? We want to build an outdoor dining area. We want to rebuild the pool or add a new pool or something like that. That tends to come from other places. But the maintenance capital is really about replacement of your current assets. So that's an important number to know, right? When you use, hopefully our members will all use this new budget process, you'll know your forward-looking net available capital number and your forward-looking depreciation number, and boom, you have that going into the year. So it's a different perspective. I'm going to start wrapping up here quickly. And honestly, we could do probably a whole webinar series on strategic budgeting, but this is an intro, I would say, and hopefully there are some things you're taking away from it. Food and beverage is obviously the political football. We think applying strategic budgeting as a mindset, it puts it more in context of the overall club. It helps settle that profit center versus amenity debate. We know we've seen this chart 1,000 times, right? We know that 75% of clubs lose money in food and beverage, and the median club subsidizes food and beverage to about 4% of its gross profit. that's putting food and beverage in context. It's amenity, and it sucks up 4% of our gross profit, to fund that amenity, just like we do with other amenities, right? Um, we know that labor is the largest component of cost in food and beverage, right? It's generally around, 65% labor at the middle, about 40, 42, 43, 44% food cost, and you add those together, and that's why food and beverage loses money. But, so what's the strategic budgeting view when we think about what's the right way for a club to budget food and beverage? It's to start from putting it in context, right? Not thinking about, hey, how many banquets are we going to get next year? Boy, if we get 5 more banquets, we can finally hit that magic break even, right? That's the wrong starting point, in our opinion. Based on the facts and the data and what matters, budget is based on the subsidy level as a percentage of gross profit. So you might say, hey, last year we were at 3, we had a subsidy that was 3% of our gross profit. We'd like to amp up, right? We'd actually like to amp up food and beverage a little bit. We want people to really feel like this is unbelievable food quality, unbelievable service. So we actually want to go from a 3% subsidy to a 7 or 8% subsidy. Okay, it's pretty easy to, again, through this process, it's pretty easy to understand. Gross profit is one of the easiest numbers to come out of club benchmarking. A little more challenging to calculate it on your own against the standardized model that we have, but it certainly can be done, and we help clubs do that. You want to amp it up to 8%. You know what that means as a dollar amount? It's 8% of your gross profit, so it's easy to calculate that. And then, frankly, it's just set the labor ratio to hit that level, right? Does that mean we can afford to have an 85% labor ratio? I mean, some clubs have 100%, 105%. Some clubs have 55%. So set the level of subsidy that seems rational for the kind of member experience you're trying to create in food and beverage, and then set the labor ratio to hit that level. We all know, I mean, the food cost it's not a fixed cost, but it's pretty close to a fixed cost, right? I mean, it's 42, 43, 44% in plus or minus 4 percentage points, in the vast majority of clubs. And if you're going to move the needle, unless you're doing something drastic, you're only going to move the needle a couple percentage points in growth in food costs. But there's much more variability that can occur in food and beverage labor, and it's really a manifestation of the service level that you're delivering in your food and beverage venues. So moving up in labor, moving down in labor, that we think that's probably the right strategic way to budget. And then you tell the food and beverage manager, the general manager, hey, that 4% of gross profit, 8% of gross profit, it equates to $175,000, right? You've got a $175,000, burn bogey for this year. Now we need you to manage to that, right? Do we have to get into every month? Maybe in the house committee you might, but at the board level, certainly. Do we really need to get into food costs every month? Do we really need to get into, well, we were a little off this month because someone canceled a banquet? I mean, that's not really a strategic view of anything in the club, let alone food and beverage. Rather than let's increase the minimum, right? Looking at the food cost, trying to make money in food and beverage. So, backing into the budget from a level of subsidy as opposed to we should make money. Now, I know that's not always easy. This is an education process. It's not a flip the light switch. But these are all steps, and a lot of clubs are being successful in getting their boards and finance committees to think that way. So pretty critical from a budgetary perspective. And then, frankly, clubs talk a lot. I'm just about ready to finish up here. I'm going to wrap up very quickly. But a lot of clubs in their budget process talk about labor, right? Do we have too much labor? Do we not have enough labor? I'm sure you have those same opinion in the same room, in the same meeting. It is an important number. It's a representation of service, efficiency, and financial results, and it's the biggest expense in the club. So how is it possible? We all the time, right? DMs will tell us, controls will tell us, oh, we just had a board meeting and they were talking about labor nonstop. They think we have too much. We say, well, did anybody bring in the labor ratio? Did either the board member or if they were a CB member, it's easy to do. If they weren't a CB member, it's still easy to do, right? Did anybody bring in your labor ratio? Total payroll divided by operating revenue? No. How can you possibly have a discussion around the overall labor level of the club if the payroll ratio is not the guidepost for the discussion. It literally defines, are we spending, what proportion of our revenue are we spending on labor, and are we right at the median of the industry? Do we spend more on labor than most clubs? Do we spend less as a ratio? Do we spend more or less than our peer set, that whatever we're looking at, does as a percentage of their operating revenue? That's the only way you can have a discussion around too much, too little, looks about right. Again, it ties to, what kind of experience are we trying to convey? A pedestrian experience, or a literally off the charts experience that you'd only get in one of the best clubs in the country. But you have to have, and budgeting to a payroll ratio is critical. Why is it critical? Because we know once you hit about a 60% labor ratio, it's almost impossible to break even operationally. If you're at 55 in the middle, that's a very typical labor ratio. So it has a direct correlation to the net operating result of the club. So if you don't know that number, you're sort of running blind to what is a highly intelligent number. So the whole budget process, if you're trying to achieve the operational results you want and the capital results you want, it's not just setting the budgets so today they add up to those numbers. It's looking at the 5, 6, 7 indicators that we know correlate to operating result. So it's not just your math at the bottom of the spreadsheet that adds up to 0 or plus $1 million on capital. But it's the other indicators that are indicative of the internal workings of your business that are now the confidence builders, or the red flags that say, hey, your numbers add up to break even, but these ratios do not indicate a club that would typically break even, or if they indicate a club that would typically throw off a lot of surplus and you're only showing break even. So it's the proof, if you will, that where your financial model is sustainable, whole, and the numbers you added up to make sense. Tripped over that a little bit, but I think you get the point. So, and then there's obviously debt to revenue is another part. So it's that whole it's this whole dashboard view, but in the forward-looking perspective. That's the notion that we're trying to present when we talk about strategic budgeting. Business language, business mentality, and the core drivers that correlate to financial sustainability of the club. Forward-looking, not backward-looking. And then, updating that as the year goes. Frankly, at that point, the year-end results become, kind of oh yeah, we already knew that because we've been looking at these critical indicators all year long. Doesn't mean it's going to solve every problem you have, but it's a new view, and it gets the board up where they should be, frankly. So, wrapping up, clearly budgeting is not easier, but it can be easier. I'm sorry, it's not easy, but it can be easier. We think, and more effective, and with more confidence. I should have added to that. It is strategic. It is a strategic exercise. So use a strategic budgeting process, not just that internal view. Everything we've done in 5 years is about bringing the wisdom of the industry to every individual player in the industry. Why not use that in the budget process as well? And we do feel that this enables predictive management, and ultimately, if we're successful over time, we believe that this predictive management philosophy, like it is in every industry, every for-profit industry out there, every other industry out there, predictive management will become a best practice in clubs. So we're not looking backwards as much as we're looking forward. We're using the backward view to gather intelligence and to educate ourselves, but we're really using it to manage forward. And that's the win. That's the win for the industry, and it's the win for individual clubs. So that's it. I appreciate everybody's time. I think Terry can jump on and let me know if we have any questions that came in the chat box. If you want, Terry, you can unmute yourself. I don't know if I have to unmute you, but we'll.
Sure. Just one question. We have just one question, and that is being from a facilities manager asking what line items are included in the building and maintenance data.
Yeah, I would love to take that offline because we do. That's obviously a collected number, and it's for instance, we don't allocate energy across departments. We collect all the energy and utilities in one place. It's the club housekeeping staff. So whoever that was, it's easy to answer. I just don't want to take the time to do it now.
Okay, we'll be in touch with the answer to that, and also someone asked if they can get a copy of this. A link to the recording of the session will be emailed to you later this afternoon.
And certainly anybody that has any questions about, using the financial forecasting tool in club benchmarking, or just frankly about the concepts and what I meant by something, or how they might use something, you know how to get a hold of us. We're always happy to help everybody that contacts us, and we're happy to do that. So with that, we'll close up today, and I appreciate everybody joining us. Thanks, and have a great rest of the week.